Hello, my name is Jake Appelbaum, and all right, thanks to you guys in the back. I do a whole bunch of different stuff. Some of it is relevant to Tor, some of it is not. In general, I really like free software, and I do some security work, but I don't consider myself part of the security community. I'm not a white hat. I don't care about fixing corporate networks. So I'm here today to talk only about the bottom point, which is the Tor project. So Tor is a free software project that comes with a full specification. Who here in the room has used it? What are you lagging on, sir? You're the only one that hasn't. Okay, well, so there's 2,000 active relays or so in the network. Maybe today there's like 1,500. We have somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 users. And the network itself is like it's an extremely fast amount. Well, it depends. If you build a stream, sometimes the speed will come, but other times it won't. And we're working on that. We're a 501c3 nonprofit because we think to save the world, you can't be at it to make a profit. If you are, you're going to cut some corners, and part of what we're doing is, instead of trying to make a profit, we're trying to make anonymity a tangible, real thing. And some of the properties that anonymity provides, we want to make sure that those things are not compromised in the pursuit of profit. And as a result, we'll take money from anybody, basically, and we have. We are probably the only free software project to be funded by both the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Department of Defense. And I think that's pretty great. I never thought that this would happen in my life, but it's great. Google's even funded us for a secure updating program. I get to work with people that I think are awesome that work for social justice, as well as being some of the best technical people you can imagine. And so Tor, in a big picture, is that. So depending on who I'm talking with, or who Roger's talking with, we don't go to, say, my grandmother and explain Tor and say, well, you know, it's traffic analysis resistance, because my grandmother has no idea what traffic is in the context of a network. She thinks traffic is when cars are backed up on the road, right? So she doesn't know about that. And today, I'm not going to talk really too much about the other aspects. I'm just going to talk about reachability, because for the most part, a lot of the people that I work with on a basically daily basis are dealing with censorship, and they're dealing with being blocked. So they have specific needs, and depending on the system they use, those systems have specific properties. Some of the properties that they provide seem to be good because they work, where working in this case might mean reachability. But there are some unintended consequences from simply being happy because something is functional. So we try to go above and beyond. And part of what makes this system useful for blocked users and censored websites is that you don't have to worry about the data trail you leave behind. You know, you saw Moxie talking about perfect forward secrecy today, I hope. And Tor has perfect forward secrecy. So part of this is like if you use an unencrypted HTTP proxy, someone can, and in most contexts does, log all of what you do. If they log what you're doing with Tor, even if they go a couple of days later or even an hour later to the servers that were used in the circuit, if they could somehow find them, they wouldn't get anything. They would not know what you had actually done. And that's something that I think is extremely important moving forward, because we should stop trusting the infrastructure, right? It's 2010 and we still trust the infrastructure. And in some places this is exceedingly dangerous. So what is censorship to you guys, right? Like I think in many cases people think of censorship as being something that is the other, right? Censorship happens elsewhere. It happens outside of the society that you live in. But censorship is everywhere. And often we hear about it in the context of the other. And so in some of my travels, I've had the opportunity to see both the United States and its censorship through the DMCA, and also other places where there's a lot of non-transparent censorship that happens. And so I think it's pretty depressing worldwide how this is generally tolerated. And when you talk with someone from China about censorship, they think, well, you know, it's just bad people that are being censored. It's okay, and you shouldn't meddle with the affairs of someone else's house anyway. When I talk with someone in the United States, they explain, well, you know, we only block bad people. And there's always rationalizations. But at the end of the day, people are saying the problem is speech, right? And so the answer that they propose is to censor speech. Instead, I think that objectively we need more speech, right? Instead of censoring images of horrific crimes, let the crimes stand and let those pictures be shown to the world so that we are forced to deal with the actual issue and not simply the symptom. Right? If you see a picture of a crime being committed and you erase the photograph, you do not erase the crime. So it's extremely important that we talk about what's actually happening and that we take action instead of simply being submissive to things that are happening around us, whether it's a crime against children or whether it's a crime against humanity on a large scale during a war. And so it's too bad, but in general what you see, as I put here, is authoritarianism triumphing over the individual on a regular basis. And I think that we can combat this. Everyone in this room is in a position of privilege to combat this, actually, because raise your hand if you have an internet connection at your house. How about a computer? Right? Okay, it's about equal. So the thing is that each one of us can make an effort in our daily lives to actually change this if we want to, if we actually care. So instead of having outrage fatigue, we can go home and we can tangibly help a person who previously was without help. And that's, I think, extremely important. And so we can sort of push this back. So I've gotten some critiques over the years about who would use Tor. And generally speaking, someone has a bad experience with Tor or a good experience with Tor. When their experience is good at first, they say positive things about it. When they have a bad experience, they believe that Tor completely consists of only people doing that bad thing, which is not true. So I want to tell you about some of the people that I've worked with. Recently, I went to the Arab Bloggers Conference in Beirut, Lebanon, and the people that I was working with and teaching about Tor or talking with them about OTR and PGP and how to use it safely in concert with Tor, they were people that were fighting against Egyptian police that had put people in jail and held them there after they had been ordered to release them by the courts. These are people that were just being held indefinitely. These are bloggers that were fighting against that, and some of them were successful. Noah Atef is a blogger from Cairo who actually managed to free a man after he had been ordered to be free, after 8 years of I think it was 8 years where he had been held without a real trial, and by the 12th year, he had simply just been sitting in jail because the police officer didn't like the person, and she was able to actually free him. So people like her are people that I think she's out about the work that she does, and so she has a position of privilege in her society, also being a woman from the Muslim world who is extremely eloquent in the way that she speaks and in the way that she writes. She is able, I think, to effectively advocate in a way that not everyone else can, but that doesn't invalidate their points. But the people that I was working with, they were not doing bad things. They were doing admirable things. They were using Tor because their position of privilege in society is not always what our position in our society is. So journalists, for example, also face an extremely high cost. I went to Qatar to work with Al Jazeera and to explain to Al Jazeera how to use Tor. And one of the things that they told me was that when their journalists go to places, sometimes without naming a specific country, sometimes those countries will find them and kick them out, find them and arrest them, find them and do something. The United States has, for example, killed a bunch of Al Jazeera journalists and targeted them specifically knowing they were Al Jazeera journalists, directly bombing them. So without location anonymity, their ability to report on the truth has cost them tangibly lives. Their organization has had their friends murdered. If you go to Al Jazeera headquarters, you actually get to see, here's the clothing of one of our journalists after we picked up what was left of his body, right? So anonymity in their case allows them to tell a story about what is happening, and without it, it can cost them their lives. Now, that doesn't mean that Al Jazeera is going to be using Tor for something. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't know. But it's extremely important to them to have that type of integrity and to have that choice in their hands instead of in someone else's, because in some cases, many cases, it will cost them their life for it to be otherwise. And of course, there's always different people that come to blogger conferences that just simply work in technology. And those people are really interesting because they'll set up Tor relays in countries where I wouldn't travel, for example. And I think those people are very brave. And I think that they are also, I admire them in a way that I think that their lives are worth emulating. And so I'm really inspired by them. And I think that people should know that people that use Tor in another country or that are in this country are not simply using it for things that are bad. Although perhaps if you are against Al Jazeera, you'd like that people sit in jails without a trial and after they've been ordered to be released, then perhaps these are not good users. But for me, those are good uses of Tor, and I'm very happy and proud of that. So since it's a technical conference, I want to give you a crash course in Tor, and I don't want to read over this too much. It's most of the text on these slides is here because I want the slides to be useful after the talk is over. But basically, Tor is used for TCP connection. Since almost all of you have used it, you know it has limited DNS support. We use a subset of servers as directory authorities. They look at all the servers that are available. They take a snapshot. They say, this is the Tor network. From there, clients choose some servers. They build a circuit. And now you have an anonymous TCP connection. Part of this is that geographic diversity gives us security. If you build a circuit that goes from California to Iceland through Zimbabwe, exits through Germany, and you visit a site in, say, Taiwan, the Taiwanese only see one end of that. Someone monitoring you only sees the other. It's very difficult for someone to watch that entire circuit. This gives you some really good anonymity. It gives you location anonymity. It gives you identity anonymity. It gives you a whole bunch of great stuff. And depending on how you use the software, such as Firefox and Tor button used together, you actually have the ability to protect yourself in a way that you might not otherwise be able to. So in the case of Iran, we've seen a couple of people crop up in this space where we were happy that they wanted to help. Their hearts were in the right place, mostly. And they advocated single hop proxies because they work. So here's how you set up a squid proxy, here's how you set up an open HTTP proxy, here's how you find it. Unfortunately, those types of systems are, as I referred to them before, I said that they work, and so people use them. The problem with that is that working in this context is actually working against you in some cases. So what did the Iranians say about that? They actually said, if we read this quote from the Iranian National Police Chief, that those who organize or issue appeals about opposition protests have committed a crime worse than those who take to the streets. And they say they're watching them. So, of course those proxies work. It would be fantastic for them to continue working too, because they provide a very valuable source of intelligence gathering. They are able to watch what people are doing, log them, build social networks. This is an extremely dangerous thing. So by using things that simply work, they may be working in ways that are unintentional for you or for the people that you're working with. So encouraging people to use something because it is, say, faster, people have said, well, Tor is too slow. And the question I have to ask to them, especially in the cases of Iran, or in the case of someone here in the United States who might be a whistleblower against a large pharmaceutical corporation or against an oil company, or, I don't know, against Greenpeace. It doesn't really matter what. Depends on what your threat model is and what you're afraid that the responding party will do. I mean, when it comes down to it, the question might be, how fast do you want to die? And I think the answer should probably be very slowly, thank you very much. And so as a result, the trade-off of speed is almost always worth what you get, right? If you use an HTTP proxy, it allows someone to target you. If you use a simple one-hop proxy like anonymizer.com or something else like that, Anonymizer can say, you know, all these people coming from Iran are totally worth wiretapping, and we could like make some buddies with the CIA by just wiretapping all of them and like shipping that data over to them, right? So using a single hop proxy, even with a completely trusted administrator, is terrible because they are subject to wiretapping even if they don't know it. They've got a Cisco router upstream, they're totally screwed, right? They can't make those guarantees. And the users can't make the guarantee that they won't be targeted. And everywhere they go, they leave behind the IP address or the signatures of the network they've traveled through. So it's an extremely dangerous thing, I think, to use something that isn't a multi-hop network. So you might be familiar with the Billboard Liberation Front from the People's Republic of San Francisco. You have to ask yourself, right? I'm here criticizing, I'm saying like Iran does this kind of wiretapping, and I could talk about China, but let's face it, the United States is not different, except in one way. The information that's gathered is not being acted on today. But as Moxie so eloquently put it, what will happen in 20 years when someone compromises your PGP key? What will happen to the log files that tell a different story than the truth? And what happens when I get access to those log files in 10 years? Right? What if I put in some messages just waiting for year 20 to roll around? The thing about these types of messages being kept around is that they tell a truth that may not have ever occurred. And they may paint a story, or they may paint a picture that is not anywhere near the reality that you experienced. And it could also be that you just happened to look like it was your story, even if it was absolutely real and it did happen. So your IP address could rotate one day, and you might be associated with logs that are a criminal offense. And that's a kind of scary thing in a world with a statute of limitations that's quickly disappearing, right? So we're not really that different, right? We have to look to ourselves. to this. I mean, the AT&T building at 2nd and Folsom in the United States is just as bad in some regards as the wiretapping that has been happening in other countries. So I think that is something that is, in fact, a little scary, and I don't know what the solution to that is, because this is a very socially acceptable and reasonable thing. It's a set of trade-offs that, in some ways, we've been told that we accept and that we've chosen, when we haven't really chosen it. And in fact, it was a crime when it started, and it still is a crime now, but nothing is happening to prosecute the people that were involved. So one of the solutions we suggest, and this is how Tor works, is that Alice wants to talk to Bob. She talks through these relays. She picks a set. She encrypts them. Relay 1 knows who she is. Relay 3 knows where she's going, doesn't know it's a she, doesn't know where she is, doesn't know anything else. Relay 2 knows some subset of the other nodes, but doesn't know really anything else because it's encrypted. And this is what we call privacy by design. If you try to beat me up and I'm relay 1, all I can tell you is Alice was trying to use Tor. That's it. But I can't tell you anything else. And if I'm relay 3, you can beat me up and I can never reveal Alice. And this is really important because it means relay 3 can't say, okay, these are all Iranians. I mean, maybe they can tell because of the content of the conversation, but if someone uses a VPN over Tor, then it becomes very difficult. If someone uses SSH, if they use TLS and they're not being man in the middle by Moxie, then it's definitely the case that they have a better shot at not being targeted, right? And in fact, that's why we built the system this way. We say 3 hops is good because that's quantifiable. You can very clearly see the first, the second, and the third each have different roles. And adding more roles in the middle does not necessarily mean that something will not be able to track you. I mean, like, there's no way that adding 4 more hops is going to make that more secure, right? Because those 4 hops will still have the same properties as relay 2 in the middle. They'll have some idea about the subset of nodes, and ultimately, it might even be worse for you. It depends on how the traffic traverses the network. We really need more exit relays. And since this is a highly technical group of people, if you have a computer that's on all the time and it has a reasonable internet connection that is more than 14 kilobytes of data transiting available, running an exit relay is super useful. And in the United States, it's probably one of the most defensible things you can do. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has been looking for years for someone that's willing to have a squeaky clean record, and if they get in trouble, to call on them for help. I believe that offer still stands. You should check with them first. But it seems to be the case that it would be foolish to run this, for example, in Saudi, but probably fine to run it here in Boston. And in fact, I run somewhere between 10 and 15 Tor servers in 10 different countries around the world because I very clearly believe this. And I'm not willing to advocate that you do a thing that I myself wouldn't do. So if you want to help, this is a direct way that you can help. And there is some risk, but thanks to the DMCA, every time someone says, hey, you're committing a crime, you've shared this bodacious boobies.avi file through BitTorrent or something like that, you can say, well, the DMCA protects me. I am a network service provider, and I do not host that content. Every time I've ever gotten a DMCA takedown, I have responded with that letter, and I have never heard a single thing since for every single request. And I've been doing this for well over 5 years now. So I think your risk in the United States is about proportional. It's directly proportional to the amount of effort you want to put into it, but luckily for you, you are protected proportionally to your level of privilege in your society. So I think it's super useful to do this. There are other places where this is also the case. Canada is pretty good for running a relay. You don't have the same DMCA protection, but you have a different set of legal liabilities about file sharing, so that is very useful to you. Sweden is another place. The Pirate Party, has everyone here heard of the Pirate Party in Sweden? They're the 3rd largest political party in Sweden. They run a Tor exit server because they believe that secrecy of the post, they believe in freedom of speech and the ability to read and write and to think freely. Those are fundamental rights, and that's part of their actual platform. So their platform actually includes running a Tor exit server, right? So this is not just like a hacker thing where hackers just kind of run these servers. This is a real thing that lots of people are doing around the world because they want to improve society. Yep.
A question, you may have a slide coming up. What is to prevent one of the many tools today to keep track of the brothers that the hops are pulling like and track it back to you all immediately when the circuit is made?
So I'll explain how the circuit is built, and then this will be it'll be apparent. So here's the deal. All the servers, they have what are called descriptors. Descriptors are basically a set of things that you need per server to use them. So you've got some public key information, you have IP addresses, you have port number, et cetera, right? You put them up, the servers all consents, although I've been told I shouldn't use the word consents. I will go with consents anyway, you know? I Googled it, it was there, therefore it exists. They take that, they sign that. Every user has the public keys for those servers embedded in the binary. So what that means is those trusted directory authorities are actually baked into your Tor client. You can change them if you want. You shouldn't, but you can. And I run one of the Tor directory authorities. There is transparency about who runs them, so it's not just like a shadowy cabal. It's people who really care, who are active in development. And we make these signatures on an hourly basis, and we push out a cache, a list of the consensus, to a bunch of other Tor servers. And if you've ever connected, you can simply pull down that list. If you haven't, you connect to a directory authority. You could get it via email. There's other things you could do. But in general, you get this list, you verify it, and then you choose which path. Unfortunately, because you get that full list, that makes it exceptionally easy to block, right? Because what the Chinese government has done, and I'll go into this in a minute, is they've done just that, right? They take the list and they block it. So other things that seem to be the case that are a little bit frustrating but easy to work around include our website is being blocked in a lot of places, right? That was an understatement. I gave a talk in Canada at a conference center in Vancouver, and I said to everyone in the audience, like, all right, everybody in the audience who doesn't have Tor on your computer, like, why don't you just, download this and we'll get going. And at the end of the talk, if you haven't figured it out, I'll walk through it with you and we can get it all set up. A couple of people raised their hand and said, I'm having trouble downloading Tor. I thought that censorship was just a problem in other places. And it turns out that even in Canada, at I think it was maybe TELUS, the TELUS Conference Center, I forget, they had been filtering Tor. And so trying to reach the Tor website at this conference center where I was invited to give a talk about Tor, I was unable to actually get those people there. And that was part of the reason that we wrote Get Tor. And so what we did was we went back to like the idea of how wares trading used to work way, way back in the day, and we wrote a small robot that delivers Tor via email. So if you have access to an SMTP server, you can download a copy of Tor along with digital signatures. And it's easy to find the public keys that sign it on the internet, as well as by asking us if you're really worried about it. And so you can very easily just download Tor this way. And it turns out that this is like extremely effective. For right now, we get something like, I think we had 30 million downloads of Tor or 40 million downloads of Tor last year. And that's pretty good. That's a significant amount of bandwidth. And these are the people that every day were having issues downloading Tor, and they used the mail robot instead. And this spiked. At one point when I was doing a training in Hong Kong, I had this, I think, somewhere like several thousand people use this because the Great Firewall of China was supposedly about to change its rules and block all Google services, so people were terrified that Gmail would be blocked. They have a Twitter clone in China, and someone on the Twitter clone said, hey everybody, if you're worried, and you should get a copy of Tor right now and download this, and you will be able to get around the filtering when it happens. And so we saw like thousands of people send emails asking for copies of Tor. And so it's a little ghetto, right? But that's because this is not exactly how the internet is supposed to work. We are treating censorship as damage and routing around it, as John Gilmore is most famously quoted for saying. It works though, because it's really hard to do SMTP filtering, right? So it's not exceptionally hard to block this if they have control of all the mail servers, but Start TLS makes that a little more difficult. Opportunistic encryption makes that a little more difficult. And because we released this program as free software, people in their communities that were able to punch through the firewall were able to download and mirror Tor and mirror all the stuff that GetTor hands out, and then they just set up an email address that has nothing with Tor in the name at all. And now they are able to distribute it back to their communities. And they have set up systems of resistance within their own communities that are totally decentralized from us. So these are just statistics of people that have been using it lately through us. Unfortunately, this brings about a couple serious problems. One is that people realized, the censors in this case in certain countries, that it was a necessity to actually block the protocol itself. Just blocking the website was not working, and they recognized that. So there's a couple unintended consequences that happen here that are quite amusing. Namely, it appears that if you are running a Tor server and you need to connect to Baidu, you can never connect to Baidu because the firewall doesn't think about you in a bidirectional way, or if it does, they've set the rules up to drop your packets. But they say, oh, that's a Tor server. Someone's trying to make a connection to a Tor server, even though it's actually a user on the Tor server that is using it for general web browsing. So every Tor server, including my home internet connection, instantly dropped off the internet for connecting to China, which was quite hilarious. Which, in this case, I'm lucky. It wasn't my whole apartment building that dropped off the internet because they specifically filtered the IP address and the port number. And then that was for connecting out to me. But my IP for everything connecting into China was filtered, but it wasn't the net block. So I'd re-DHCP'd and we started again. And I mean, I think that that is a very frustrating reality, but that's okay. We can work around that because we can change and we can adapt. It's a peer-to-peer network, so it's like self-healing, right? So if we change our IP address, then they have to update their rules. So there is, of course, a hope, so to speak, which is that all of the blocking initiatives that happen right now rely on the fact that they have some piece of information that allows them to filter, right? So generally that's an IP address and a port number, but maybe it's just an IP address or a net block. So we built a darknet, and the darknet is called bridging, and it's very simple. It works like this. Alice wants to send a message to Bob, but some of the Bobs she wants to talk to are blocked. So instead, she talks to Bob the Bridge, and Bob the Bridge is a Tor relay that is not in the public directory. And so now, I just helped the journalist who's working in China to set this up. I set up a private bridge for him, which will basically never be discovered by the Chinese. And Bob the Bridge is going to help that journalist to connect from Beijing, or wherever he happens to be, and into the normal Tor network. So now he gets all the properties of Tor, and he doesn't have to trust me with any of the stuff he's doing. I don't know which newspaper he works for, or what he's doing, or anything. I just sympathize with the idea of trying to speak freely. And so I've given him access to this system. And as you can see, blocked Alice down there doesn't have a friend outside, which is a little bit too bad for her. And so she can't connect to the public Tor network. And in theory, she probably can't connect to very much else either. So bridging is really useful. But there's public bridges and there are private bridges. So we split up a list of bridges, and we give them out to different people depending on the context. So if someone visits bridges.torproject.org, the website, they get a list of bridges, and they get a list of bridges returned based on geo-IP information about them. If they use Tor to connect to it, they also are treated as one unit. They're treated equally. And we give that to them because we think it's basically impossible to control how to give that information out over the long term, but in the short term, we think we can help people with that. And when IP addresses rotate, for example, it's possible for certain Tor clients, if they still have access to one working bridge, to rekey and to talk to the bridge authority and get an IP address again. So it heals, even if some of the bridges block, as those bridges change, they automatically start working again. And so this is a much harder thing for people to block. And it really works too. So the People's Republic of China's 60th anniversary was a monumental occasion, right? I mean, this is a really big deal. And it was the first time we saw a major blocking event in China. This is a server I run in Holland that pushes somewhere around, I mean, right now, at the moment it's not, but at the time it was pushing somewhere between 100 and 300 megabits a second of traffic. That's a bit, right? Fair bit. It's sponsored by a really nice gentleman who started the internet service provider Access for All, Rob Gongrip, and he's a super cool guy. So a lot of thanks to him actually for this, because you can see until this blocking happened, this is just statistical averaging with some privacy involved here, because we don't actually collect the IP addresses. But we saw around 10,000 individual unique Tor clients connecting to my relay every day. And then around the anniversary, but not quite up to the anniversary, just right before it, we saw that we went from 10,000 to 0 with a little bump. A little bump was a hiccup in their system probably. But we can actually look at this and we can see that this is a graph of oppression right there, right? If you're wondering what censorship and oppression looks like on the internet, that's it right there. And if you're wondering what it looks like when people fight back, it looks like that, right? So every single person that was using Tor, we think, that wanted to get around Tor not working, instead of downloading a new update or something, They learned about bridges, they got bridges, and they used them exactly at the same time. So see that again, right there? Like that, right? So these people were treating censorship as damage and routing around it effectively. And I think that's powerful because it tells you about what they want in a democratic sense. These people don't want to be filtered. They want access to things like Gmail. They want access to things like Twitter. And so we think that's working pretty well. But it's still a losing battle, right? Because at some point, China will get access to a full list of bridges. Maybe they'll compromise some machines. Maybe they'll start compromising users directly. That might be easy. I'm sure that it is, in fact, easy. You can go to someone's house and take their computer. The person doesn't really have much to go on. And it's hard to stay secure in that way. So at the moment, we're seeing a quarterly blocking event, which is pretty bad, I think, but it's going to get much worse if they speed up. And we're not at war with China. The Tor project is not at war with China. And we're not trying to bloody their nose in any way, but they're very fiercely searching for things to block. And it is a reality. So we have to deal with that reality that in some places, our services don't work as well as we like them to. And so we've been coming up with tactics to fix that. There's a really interesting thing that happens, and I'm sure it's apparently obvious by the last sentence in this slide. They actually take the consensus list, and then that's their block list. So what if all the Tor directory authorities consensed on all the IP addresses and port numbers of all of the embassies of all of the world where Chinese people had to apply for visas? What kind of uproar would that cause, right? So there are some interesting avenues for attacking back if we felt like it. We're not taking it there, but we could, because that's the kind of sloppy stuff that's going on here. It's just wholesale blocking of things. There might be some testing involved based on the fact that they seem to block by IP and port, but the testing might be that's the IP and port we found in the consensus, not we connected and decided that was an undesirable service. So we think that that is an interesting thing. And that's the reality of China today. So I recently traveled to the Middle East, and I was kind of a little bit surprised to notice that while I was in Lebanon, that the proxy system that exists in Lebanon, one, exists, because I was told that it doesn't, and two, it was blocking Tor. So like my ability to work there is really only possible because the objectionable content happens to be about getting around filters against objectionable content. So lucky me. But for all the rest of the people that were undesirables, but still somehow let into the country, they were having trouble with this. And I was very surprised to see that. So that's what it looks like, right? And you can tell a little bit about the filter by the message it returns, content underscore filter underscore denied. That looks like something you could find in some source code, right? Well, it turns out it's some Squid web proxies, right? So there are the IP addresses, go to town, right? You have to reposition from inside Lebanon to reach them, but that's not hard, right? Lebanon is full of unpatched boxes. So this is Ojero, right? These things are so loaded, it's ridiculous. When packets pass through them and they go through the filter, you get an addition of like 1,000 or 2,000 milliseconds of latency, right? The amount of traffic passing through them is gigantic, as far as I can tell, and it's ridiculous. I mean, they just basically don't work. And these are super old, right? I mean, well, they're not as old as they could be, but as we know from the 26C3 from Fab's talk, we know that this is not good, right? There are a bunch of remotely exploitable bugs in Squid. And they force, in some cases, they force people through these proxies. So they're forcing people basically to open themselves up to like a whole security nightmare that they otherwise might not have. And this is actually the ISP because supposedly at the national level, they don't have filtering, right? There's no mandatory filtering. And we can also really easily find it. So I'll walk you through it, right? I know the DNS records right there are correct. Because I was able to tunnel out, I was able to compare what I got inside the country to outside of the country. There are some automated tools for doing this, but just for simplicity's sake, this is what is useful here. So there's the DNS request. We see torproject.org's DNS is not being tampered with. But then if you notice TCP traceroute, now ICMP tracerouting, you actually don't have this problem. Like you see, and maybe they're running Moxie's old traceroute tool that he wrote for faking traceroutes, but in this case, they totally screwed up, right? When you do a TCP traceroute, you actually see the fourth hop is this host that's supposedly in Austria, right? We're talking, I'm in Lebanon, I'm in Beirut. I'm not 4 hops from Austria, no matter how you count it. And so port 80 is just being returned by 4 hops upstream. So that's really easy to detect, right? And we can also look at the latency for that. which is kind of interesting. Like you'll note that there's some stuff in between there that's like a little bit overloaded. Like what is that? 2,500 milliseconds? Jesus, right? Port 443 behaves differently. That's a little more like it, right? You see 7 hops and we're in London. So it didn't actually tamper with the TCP connection going through entirely, right? So in the place where it decided it wasn't going to do man in the middle, it just let it through. And you could actually see the difference based on port number. So at some point, your packets diverge and get shunted off into another network. That's really easy to detect, right? It's really easy to automate this kind of test. Those people are amateurs. Their filters are crap. So it's also interesting because supposedly they're optional. But when I went to Cafe Tamarbuta, which is a leftist anarchist type cafe in Beirut, I found that the filters were enabled. And when I asked around, nobody actually knew about these filters until I found just some kind of like random guy that worked at the cafe, and he's like, oh yes, I think we turned that on in order to save costs on bandwidth. The ISP told us we would be saving costs on bandwidth. So I don't know. I mean, in some cases, people choose this, but for almost everybody that entered the cafe and for many people at home, maybe it's on by default, maybe it's not on by default, your mileage may vary. I think it's kind of slimy to do that kind of filtering, and especially to do it so poorly and to put everyone at risk that travels through your filters. So in any case, if you want, the IP addresses are in the slides. You can take a look at them. This has got to be the most unfortunate name for an ISP in the Arab world. I mean, I understand that it's like EarthNet. I get that. I get the meaning. But TerraNet sounds like a bad South Park joke, right? So it's Terra. Okay. So their proxy system is equally bad, but harder to detect. You can detect that it is in fact not what you would expect based on the fact that certain types of logins would reflect different IP addresses. And so in this case, we were going through a proxy 85.112.95.11, but at the local cafe, my IP address was 212.98.138.15. So for web traffic, I was again shunted to another proxy, and that proxy did content filtering. Of course, you can see again, what's that? 2 hops to California? Probably not. They were a little better though. If you note, the load on that proxy in terms of responding is really low, right? That's not 2,500 milliseconds. That's actually a little realistic. Like if you didn't know better, you might think that they actually had a really good quality of service. They don't. So this is Qatar. Well, traveling, this is when I went to meet with Al Jazeera. And in Qatar, the thing that I noticed was that they have a telecom monopoly, and lots of places in the world have telecom monopolies, so that's not special. But their filter is like so obvious. Like they didn't even try to hide it, right? They didn't even make a slight effort, which in a way is nice, right? They're transparent about their lack of transparency, basically, right? And that's nice. But the thing is that there's a reason for that. Your ability to make a difference in this society is pretty much none, right? I asked someone, how does a road get built here? And they said, I don't know. A road just gets built. You know, you're taken care of. Just think about that. Roll that over in your mind for a second, right? As the solution to civil engineering, you were taken care of. That could mean a lot of things in a lot of different ways. I don't want to be taken care of, probably, especially when you're going to bulldoze my home. That sounds like I might be in the house still. So, I mean, for me, I found that to be a little bit scary. So yeah, of course they're transparent about the fact that they're doing this proxying and this censorship because you can't do anything about it. They have a monopoly on the telecom, and if you want to resist, maybe you get arrested. It appears that my hotel was basically filtered by what's called NetSweeper, I think. Now I'm not 100% certain on this, but that URL down there at the bottom looks a lot like what NetSweeper's URL looks like. So the fact that they weren't masking it actually allowed me to unmask the Canadian company that's based in Toronto, Ontario, if that is in fact their software. You can also notice that you can apply like different filters, like username equals filters, and then the net block of my hotel. You can also tell some other things about it, which I think is kind of interesting because you can probe the filter, right? You can like try to go to certain other places and see, oh, is this web page blocked? So it's like super easy to automate a checklist for Qatar because Qatar uses, no kidding, censor.qa, right? proxy1.isp.qa and censor.qa. They're like total. I mean, it's like if you look at Bahrain, it's the same. Only theirs is, I think, Anonymous is the host name for their TLD or something like that. But that's okay, right? Because hiding it isn't really going to make a difference. They don't care. You can't do anything about it. You can't change that, right? We, as outsiders, probably have even less power to change it in some regards, except through things like economic sanctions and through trying to convince people to subvert them so that the filters are more costly than they are effective. I think that is probably a better option than economic sanctions because, frankly, if you can get past the filter, that's it. It's done. They're not going to spend a lot of money on an arms war. But if you think that it's helpful to contact people, here are the chief executive officers of NetFilter, or this NetSweeper software, right? So you can contact them and let them know that you think they're a bunch of motherfuckers for selling their software to the Qataris. Now, it could be the case that it's not them. But one way to ask is to call and clarify. So I have an interest in Iran. Specifically, I have an interest in outright violence against people that are basically peacefully protesting. I think that it's pretty much completely unacceptable to shoot people when they're protesting. I think that in general, Guy Debord was right. People protest to make themselves feel better, and they generally don't make any social change. But it's pretty clear that in Iran, in the latest uprisings that have happened, this is not the case. Those protests were actually effective. And those protests were not just to make people feel better. And the government responded accordingly. The Iranians actually had one of my machines pulled off the internet because they did not appreciate the scanning that I was doing. So I put several more machines back online and doubled up my efforts. If you would like this scan data, I would be more than happy to give it to you. I scanned basically every host in Iran. And I'll tell you about their police network in a minute. So basically what happens in Iran is they have a knob, right? They say, okay, social unrest is high. We're going to turn the internet down. And then they turn the internet back up. They make certain services unreliable. They filter certain things. They do some pretty nasty stuff, I think. And as we learned earlier, they are at least telling people they're watching everyone, and they certainly have the capability to do so. Arbor Networks released a really interesting report that talked about how they pulled a bunch of data lines and then they put them back in about a gigabit at a time. And that's about the capacity that filters have. So they basically replugged in each filter, got new transit upstream through, say, Russia or other places, and those new connections, each one was like a clean feed, so to speak. And so it's definitely the case that they have some interesting government level filters. But then, just like the Great Firewall of China, they also have ISP level filters. So the filtering that you see at one level is not necessarily the result of like an all-seeing, all-perfect government or an all-seeing, all-perfect ISP. It's some combination of them, and you can get past all of it. So I'd like to take a moment to point out that Nokia is part of the problem, and we are also part of the problem. Because Nokia has justified their use of wiretapping software and their necessity to build it into their products because the West requires it for things like CALIA. So what we are doing when we make a trade-off in our society about wiretapping is that we are making that trade-off for people that do not have the rights, the responsibilities, or the abilities to make that trade-off in their own society. So Nokia says they are building wiretapping infrastructure into their equipment because we require it. And so it's, of course, ethical to sell it to the Iranians. And I think that they are right in that we are part of the problem and that we should not be forcing them to do that here and certainly not there. Because, in fact, an unintended consequence that costs people their lives is the fact that that wiretapping equipment is used to watch people, to gather information about people, to target them, and to kill them, straight up. And that's our responsibility to fix, right? Now, we're not in Finland, but of course, if you've ever seen a Nokia telephone switch, if you've ever seen Nokia telephones, if you've ever seen Nokia products, we are part of that ecosystem. And I think it's up to us to fix it. If you'd like to see and confirm the telecom software they're using, there's the IP address, 80.191.2.0/24. Take a look. Another one, if you're interested in the besieged militia that shot Netta in the heart, that nice girl who wasn't even part of a protest, webmail.besiege.ir. Those people are the ones that shot her. Feel free to take a look. They run Horde as their webmail system. Code execution is possible. Wondering about the people that are protecting her? let's see, you might be interested in smsmonitoring.itrc.ac.ir. You might also be interested in some of the SIP proxy information and the media proxy. These are the censorship and Spook Central hosts that are of interest. They are not filtered, they are not firewalled. You pop a shell in these boxes, you own the Iranian government. You know, just saying. So, I mean, I think that you cannot just simply stand idly by when you see stuff like this happening in the world, right? You can't be neutral on a moving train. You are in fact choosing to do something by doing nothing. So I think that if you're here, you're already choosing to do something and you can continue. So Andy Mueller from the CCC gave me this image and I think it's pretty great, right? When people are talking about what they're doing abstractly, it is not so useful. I mean, it's nice to talk about what Nokia is doing, but let's face it. This is what Nokia is helping to enable. This is what Siemens is helping to enable. This is what we, as a society, are exporting to them. And I think that we should ask whether or not that's what we want. I feel like the privileges and freedom that we enjoy in the United States and Canada and Western Europe and in other parts of the world, they shouldn't be taken for granted. And we do sort of take them for granted and forget that it is in fact us that have created this just as much as we create other things. So I'd like to share a funny story. This Iranian black hat popped on an IRC channel where I am, and he says, hey, I want to tell you about a bug. I think you should put this into Tor because it would be really useful. And I didn't think it was a good idea to put it into Tor. No one else really did, but it is extremely funny. Their filters literally did not know the difference between get without spaces and get with spaces. So GET space torproject.org, blocked. G space E space T space torproject.org, totally not blocked. Right? So their filters are actually trivial to bypass in multiple ways. And there's this group called the Green Anti-Sec group, which is like, I don't even know why they picked that name, but whatever. They released a small proxy, and all it does is take all of your requests and split them. So it's a super simple, low-tech, I mean, just really easy. But because we know that people are clearly monitoring them, it's a super bad idea to use that technique. It's just funny to let you know about the code quality of these proxies and to let you know how they're kind of shoddy and how they're put together. But that, I think, is even more scary because I'm sure that they're also compromised. I mean, it's probably not too much effort to compromise them. And most of this is technologically quite simple. But socially, it is in some ways simple, and in other ways it is extremely effective. And we have to work towards changing the social norms. I mean, one of the interesting things is the bigger the censorship becomes, the tighter this gets, you actually find that people resist it more. You find normal people are not able to search for things like breast cancer research or certain things about women's liberation or the things that they need to do their homework. And this causes them to reject the filter. And these are people that aren't activists, they're just normal people. So there's sort of like a normalization phase that's taking place with a lot of filters around the world. And I think that we can be part of that dialogue to change that, because I think that part of that normalization should be the removal of the filters. Because not only do they present a serious risk to people on the internet, they, in some way, are saying, we will allow the marginalization of this percentage of our society based on some authoritarian, non-transparent idea. And I think that that is really dangerous. So I want to show an example of Burma, because I think that Burma is quite interesting. The military junta purchased some Fortinet software called FortiGuard, and they denied it at first. This is one of their salespeople handing Fortinet gear to the military junta on television. They stopped denying it. So they apparently are gone. I think it's the OpenNet initiative that said that they aren't there, or it could be Peacefire, I forget exactly who. But that to me says that it's good that they were able to get out of that. But if you scan Burma, which by the way, they have about 180 hosts that are reachable from the internet. They have 2 net blocks that are of considerable size, and 180 computers can be reached. Everything else is filtered, like entirely. No packets get through. And now it's mostly just Cisco routers with the remote login enabled. So, I mean, there's something to be learned from that, right? Which is that, we complain, and some companies change their behavior, but ultimately, not everything is going to change overnight. We can make small victories, but we can't exactly make Burma completely uncensored overnight. I mean, we can try. There are people that use Tor in Burma, I hear. I have never been to Burma. I will probably never go to Burma. But it does seem to me that people can subvert them, but part of the problem is us again. I mean, Cisco is a big multinational corporation, and they don't seem to care too much about who they sell their equipment to. I don't know how the Burmese IP space is so filled with Cisco gear, because as I understand it, there are actually sanctions against Burma that make that illegal. But what's international law anyway, right? I mean, it's a myth, essentially. So I think that it's super important to also remember that Tor is great for some of the internet stuff, but I recently talked with a man in Berlin, and he told me that some police have a new tactic. And their tactic is that they allow people to have a flash mob and to protest, and they come out with IMSI catchers, because people bring their cell phones, because that's how they knew about the flash mob in the first place. And then the next day, they round them up and they torture them. Right? So that's a really hard adversary to beat, right? And that's very concerning to me, actually. So part of this is knowing that some of the infrastructure that's in use is just not trustworthy. We just can't do it right. So like with Moxie's encrypted telephone stuff that he's working on, that's fantastic stuff for certain threat models. But encrypted calls don't hide your associations. And your associations might be more valuable than what you say, because it doesn't matter what you say when you are an enemy. So you can do something about this. You can run a Tor bridge right now on your computer, and you will have essentially no liability. At worst, if someone who is filtering a network finds and discovers your bridge, you will be able to change your IP address and become unfiltered. And probably people that are using you will continue, and they will be able to be unfiltered again. So running a bridge is really easy. This is how you do it. You check a box. It could not be easier to actually make a solid difference in someone's life, right? Just like right away. You install Tor, you say, I want to help censored users reach the Tor network. Those people I mentioned before, those human rights activists that are getting people out of jail, those journalists that are telling you information about places that basically are too dangerous for anybody to go, those people rely on people to check these boxes. We have about 400 people in the world that have checked those boxes. That's not much. We need tens of thousands of people to check those boxes. And it's really simple. If you have a university internet connection, it's even easier, right? Because it's super fast. We do bandwidth limiting. You can do all sorts of different stuff to shape it, but ultimately, you check that box. If you don't want to put your email address in, you don't have to. We don't care who you are, we just care that you're helping, because it's quantifiable down to a single bit. Is your server accessible behind a firewall or not? And if it is, fantastic. And if it isn't, it probably is for lots of places in the world, and it's still useful. Even if, say, China blocks it, it's still useful in Iran. If Iran blocks it, it's still useful in Canada. It's still useful in the United States or Sweden. So you can directly help. Instead of being pissed off and walking away thinking that you can't, and this is bad stuff that we can't do anything about, you can actually help. But ultimately, at the end of the day, most of you work in influential places. You work at companies. Who here works at a company where you deal with sensitive information? Great, all right, I guess they didn't teach you not to say that. So here's the deal. I want to tell you guys about WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks is a project that when you submit information of high value, that is to say, historical data, something that is significant, it will get out to the public without outing you as being the person that brought it to the public's attention. So if you work in a company and you see people that are making profits on human rights abuses, you see people that are profiteering on killing, you can do something about this. That manager that you don't like, that's constantly making unethical decisions, when he makes that PDF, like Cisco did, talking about how the Falun Gong are an undesirable element of society and buying Cisco products will help you to crush them, you can leak that PDF and you can fuck that manager. And you'll be doing the right thing, right? And you can use Tor to do that, so that when you leak that PDF, or when you leak that information, you don't go to jail. WikiLeaks has never lost a source, and in fact, I just traveled and spent 2 weeks in Iceland with some WikiLeaks people to help write a law to create the Switzerland of bits. With approximately 16 members of the Icelandic parliament as co-authors, we are creating the Switzerland of bits, which will mean it'll be a place where we take the First Amendment, we take Swedish press protection laws, Belgian press protection laws, we put all these together, And we create a super information state where you do not erase history anymore. History can remain, even though it is electronic. Even though in theory you can erase it, in practice it will not be legal to do so, nor will threatening people to give up their sources or trying to intimidate people to erase that information, suing, libel tourism, those things will end. Iceland and Sweden are leading the way in this. But part of that is to change the world, right? The collateral murder video that WikiLeaks just released that about 7 million people have seen, that video was released by someone in the military forces that cared to show that the United States government had committed a massive human rights violation and shot unarmed civilians attempting to do the human thing of helping people that were down, that were literally shot with a .30 caliber machine gun, women and children in a van, trying to help. That video was released because that person cared to tell the truth, to show the world what was actually happening so that we can know and make decisions about things intelligently. So you can do that too, because all of you that raise your hands that work with sensitive information, you can leak that information when it's socially relevant, and you should. So it's like chocolate and peanut butter, two great things that go great together. In any case, thank you. Any questions? Seriously? All right, that's better. Yeah, don't be afraid to speak up. I mean, there is an anonymous communications channel available if you would like to use it to ask me a question.
So I'd like to run a relay of server connected server. How many EMPA letters am I going to get? Let's say a month or a year, but you must have so many.
Yeah, so in like 5 years, I've gotten 10 or something like that. Maybe a little more. But I mean, if you get one, I will personally help you draft a response. Straight up. You had a question? Tor on phones. We, Nathan, Friedis, myself, and a number of other Tor people have ported Tor to Android. So that means when you go to China with your Android telephone, and you're like, God, I really wish I could watch that YouTube video, you can transparently Torify your YouTube application that Google ships and instantly start watching YouTube videos over Tor, right? Which is really great because you can add a bridge. We have bridge support. I mean, it's just a simple port of the Tor client. It's compiled in, in C. It's cross-compiled. We also have an Android port that we hope to get into the market, which is a little different than the one that you can download from the web, specifically because if you root your telephone, you can transparently Torify something. Otherwise, you have to set up a proxy in the application itself. So we have iPhone, Nokia N900 has Tor on it now. Though the web browser is possibly not safe for actual anonymity, it's definitely useful for circumvention. If you're not worried about an active attacker or a tampering exit node, then you're probably fine. The iPhone port is being done by a man named Marco Benetti, who has it working on jailbroken iPhones, but it's like not ready for prime time in the sense that the UI is not an Apple iPhone happy looking thing. I imagine we will not be able to get past the App Store review policy. However, there are anonymous browsers that cost money in the App Store, so it's possible that Apple would be okay with that. And as far as other telephones go, we have a Java port of Tor being written by a really great guy, and that will hopefully help us with feature phones that support Java and other things, and we'll actually be able to do real anonymity on many different types of telephones when that is released, not just on super expensive smartphones. So. So there are a couple. I have not used any of them, so I cannot recommend them. But I think if you look at our website, there is one called Incognito. I have not used it. I don't really download specialized things like that. It's a little sketchy to me. It's like, the guys are really cool, they do good work, but I haven't evaluated it myself. But in general, what I do is that I use a computer, like a Linux machine, that is not targeted towards anonymity at all. And then I install Tor. We provide packages and source code, and you can build it yourself. And then you can tell IP tables, drop every packet that isn't going to the Tor proxy, and allow the Tor proxy to talk to the internet. Fails closed, you're good to go, right? You want to have Tor button installed with Firefox to use that properly, but it's pretty easy to do that. It's not really a necessity to download a whole live CD. But if you want to look at incognito, it's probably the best thing out there. There's also, I think, like an anonymo.os or something like that. I've heard there are a bunch of systems like this, but the thing about systems like that is that you can really only trust it as much as you trust the people that are working on it and you trust the software that's involved. And I don't really trust anybody or anything until I look at it and evaluate it. So I wouldn't recommend it, except to recommend that you look at it and evaluate it for yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, I know I mentioned the question before. I'm not sure if I gave an answer that I could remember my mind and see it. Yeah. You also had touched on some of the security issues that I read about. Or it, by definition, is known to anonymize, but it's not designed to be always necessarily 100% secure, but it helps with anonymity anyway. Yeah. What is, again, some tool to almost immediately create a circuit to reverse engineer your circuit and trace back to you.
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Or it does regenerate the key, but tools can work a lot faster than time for regeneration.
Sure. Okay. So the question is essentially, what about tracebacks? So just real quick, we'll go back to this. Great. Here. Okay. So the deal is that Bob sees my IP address as being relay 3 and says, all right, I'm gonna trace back that user using relay 3. Bob sees relay 3. That's all they see. How will their tool work from there? All relay 3 knows is about relay 2, right? And relay 2 only knows about relay 1. And Alice, of course, knows about relay 1, and relay 1 knows about Alice. But the thing is that the information relay 1 has is directly limited to relay 2. There is, if you compromise relay 3 entirely and you wiretap it, you still only see relay 2. So there isn't really an opportunity for you to trace it back. There are some papers that have been written about congestion, where you try to load all of the things that could possibly be relay 1 and see when there are timing differences. But now here's the trick. If you are doing something with relay 3 or relay 2 or relay 1, you are still going to end up in a situation where you don't actually have the whole circuit. Like, it's basically not possible for you in practice to find anything beyond relay 3. There have been some congestion attacks that might, in certain situations, allowed you to know about something that could have probabilistically been a relay 1, but that still doesn't reveal Alice. You need to wiretap the entire thing. Tor's circuit needs to basically be end-to-end watch to be broken. To break the assumptions, you'd have to watch the entire Tor network, because Alice is going to pick k of n, right? So if n is 2,000 servers, she picks k servers that are generally 3. So in the case of bridges, it's not.